The gallery is quiet in the particular way museums become quiet only after you have stood still long enough for your breathing to slow. Under glass, a broken rectangle of baked clay rests on a mount that holds it at a slight angle, so even a visitor who cannot read cuneiform can sense the discipline in the lines. Wedges pressed with intention, ranked in columns, a human hand trying to keep the world from slipping away. The label identifies it plainly. The Flood Tablet Penn Museum object, number CBS 1673, exhibited in the Middle East galleries as B10673. Its provenience is given as Nippur in Iraq, its language as Sumerian, its date as roughly 1650 BC, Old Babylonian by script. It is not a complete book in clay, only the lower third of a larger tablet, yet it is precisely the kind of fragment that can change how a whole story is heard, because it preserves the part that a scribe may have considered worth keeping, even when the rest was already broken. Penn Museum's description notes that CBS 1673 preserves 6 columns of text, 3 on each side, with roughly 10 to 15 lines in each preserved column, and that the original tablet likely carried around 260 lines. When a museum can say that, it means scholars have counted the surviving measures of the composition and compared them with parallel witnesses, making the loss itself measurable. The absence becomes a datum, not merely a tragedy. In the museum's own words, the text concerns the creation of humans, the founding of cities before the flood, the rulers of those cities, and then the flood itself. The summary is restrained, but it carries a sequence that feels almost procedural. Divine instructions to build cities under the protectorship of specific deities, the preservation of 5 city names, including Eridu, the port town linked to Ea, Enki, the god of water, then Enki's disclosure of a divine plan to destroy humanity by flood, communicated to Ziusudra, the king. Wind and storms arrive, followed by the flood, lasting 7 days and 7 nights. Then the sun returns, Ziusudra offers sacrifice, and after Enki pacifies the anger of the gods, An and Enlil grant Ziusudra eternal life. In one paragraph, the tablet moves from civilization making to civilization erasing, as though both belong to the same register of thought, foundation and annihilation written with the same calm hand. And the museum anchors this particular piece of clay in the wider scholarly map with its modern identifiers. CBS 1673 joins with CBS 1N867, and it is associated with ETSL 1.07.04 and a CD-Li composite Q00357, signposts that tell us this is not an isolated curiosity, but part of a reconstructible textual tradition checked against other witnesses. So where, in that measured summary, does the word war enter? It enters not as a slogan, but as a problem. In Mesopotamian literature, the most decisive conflicts do not always appear as armies meeting at walls. Sometimes they appear as deliberations, assemblies, decrees, withdrawals of protection, where the turning point is not a spear, but a decision. In this tablet's account, as the Penn Museum describes it, the decisive action is the god's plan to erase humanity, and the pivotal human act is not conquest but listening, a king receiving counsel from Enki and obeying it. If there is war, it is not yet a war we can point to on a map. It is a war between orders, between the built world of city and temple and the older world of storm, flood and silence that can return as suddenly as it once retreated. What makes the question sharper is that the narrative is not framed around a single household afloat on open water. It is framed around multiple cities and their divine patronage. The text, even in fragmentary survival, cares about names, about which deity stands over which place, about Eridu and the deep waters of Enki, about rulers who belong to a world that can be organised into lists and lines. That is the worldview of administration and cult, of a civilization that believes stability is produced through correct relationships and maintained through correct rites. And then, with little warning, the same world is described as removable. Wind and storm are not described as weather here, but as forces with intent, agents that arrive, do their work, and depart. The flood lasts a counted span of time, 7 days and 7 nights, as though catastrophe itself can be measured and closed like a ledger. Even the return of the sun is written as a transition, the restoration of ordinary perception after the long hours of drowning darkness. In a modern ear, such phrasing can sound symbolic, but an archaeologist's ear listens for something else as well. The habit of recording abrupt endings as if they were official acts, and the habit of explaining those endings not with tactical details, but with the language of judgment. This is where we need to be precise about confidence. It is certain that CBS 10673 exists as a museum object from Nippur, written in Sumerian, dated by script to the Old Babylonian period, and that the Penn Museum summarizes its preserved content as a creation and flood narrative centered on city foundations and a divinely decided deluge. It is high confidence that the composition belongs to a broader tradition, given its joins and its association with standardized scholarly corpora and composites. It is medium confidence to say that the narrative style carries an administrative calm that may reflect how scribes conceptualized catastrophe not as chaos, but as an enacted decree. And it is low confidence to say anything beyond that at this stage about war, because we have not yet defined what a Sumerian text allows the word to mean. Still, even low confidence questions have value when they are asked in the presence of the artifact itself, because the tablet does not only describe destruction, it also describes what is rebuilt afterward, sacrifice, appeasement, a negotiation that ends with one man granted enduring life, as if survival must be explained not by chance, but by a restored order. The narrative, as preserved and summarized, already hints at a cycle that will recur in other texts. The world is founded, the world is judged, the world is erased, the world is restored, not as an invention, but as an inheritance reclaimed from ruin. If we want to understand what the title calls an Anunnaki war, we have to start here, in the most modest place, with one broken tablet that treats the end of cities as something that can be written down, categorized, and remembered. Penn Museum's Flood Tablet CBS 1673 does not shout. It does not announce an apocalypse. It simply records that a decision was made, and that afterward the sun returned. And in that quiet return, we can begin to ask what else the clay might be trying to say. If war is not first a clash of weapons, but a struggle over whether civilization is allowed to remain. What would it mean in a scribal culture that measured time in reigns and restored temples to speak of an erasure so complete that only a fragment of the record survives to tell us it happened at all? There is a kind of sentence that appears in ancient Mesopotamian writing with the calm certainty of a seal impression, kingship descended from heaven. It is a phrase that does not argue. It simply places authority where it is meant to belong, above the human realm, prior to it, and capable of being granted or withdrawn. When I think of that phrase, I do not picture a metaphor. I picture an object. At the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, there is a four-sided clay prism, baked and inscribed, about the height of a forearm. The museum catalogues it as Anne 1923-444, known widely as the Weld-Blundell prism. It bears what we call the Sumerian king list, a succession of cities and rulers arranged as if history itself could be stabilized by order. The prism's text is not merely a list of names. It is a claim about how time is allowed to move, how a city rises, how kingship passes, how legitimacy is spoken into being. The Ashmolean's own description emphasizes that the prism begins with rulers of great antiquity, passes through a turning point called the flood, and then continues into more historically plausible reigns, ending in a world that resembles the political landscape of early second millennium. Mesopotamia. If a civilization needs to remember its past, this is one way it does it, not by telling a continuous story, but by stacking authority in a sequence that cannot be easily contradicted. The prism makes time visible and makes it portable. It can sit in a scholar's hand and speak of centuries. It can sit in a temple archive and assert that order has precedence over the accidents of war and famine. It can also tell us something more unsettling, that even order expects rupture. Confidence certain based on Ashmolean object identification AN 1923 port 444 and its function as a king list prism. The king list does not frame catastrophe as a random interruption. It frames it as a threshold. The phrasing is stark, then the flood swept over. In that one transition, the text splits existence into two territories, before and after, without explaining the mechanism in detail. It does not describe walls breaking, or soldiers, or the cries of a burning city. Instead, it uses a force that behaves like an eraser. The flood is not simply a disaster, it is an act that reorganizes legitimacy. Before the flood, kingship appears in a handful of cities, with reigns that stretch beyond normal human measure. After the flood, kingship returns again, now distributed in a more familiar rhythm, city to city, dynasty to dynasty, the kind of pattern that matches what we can sometimes verify from other inscriptions and archaeological contexts. The flood, as the king list presents it, is not an ending alone. It is a reset of the political world. Confidence high, based on the well-known structural flood hinge in the king list tradition and the Ashmoleans' description of its before-after framework, and this is the first place where the titles claim an Anunnaki war that erased civilizations must be handled with care, because the king list does not say Anunnaki war. It does not need to. In Mesopotamian thought, the most consequential struggle is often not between human armies. It is between the world as it is built, city, temple, kingship, and the world as it can be unmade by decree. When the king list says kingship descended, it implies a divine origin for political authority. And when it says the flood swept over, it implies that what descended can be interrupted, even reversed. The list does not dwell on the violence. It records the fact that the transfer of kingship continued afterward, as though continuity itself is the goal of remembering. It is not history written to mourn, it is history written to justify restoration. Temfidence, medium, interpretive, anchored in the king list's structure and purpose as a legitimacy document. If we stay close to the artifact, the prism teaches us a discipline. We are not permitted to treat destruction and survival as equal forces. Destruction arrives like a verdict, survival must be rebuilt as a lineage. There is an almost architectural logic here. The king list is not a chronicle of battles, it is a scaffold for sovereignty. It tells you that when a city holds kingship, it is not merely a human achievement, it is a kind of cosmic lease. And when that lease ends, the text does not ask you to blame a neighbouring king or a superior army. It asks you to accept that kingship moved because it was allowed to move. That is the kind of framing that can make catastrophe feel overnight, even when an archaeologist knows that collapses can unfold across months or years. In the scribal imagination, the decisive moment is not the slow thinning of grain stores or the gradual abandonment of neighbourhoods. The decisive moment is when protection is lifted. Confidence. Medium, interpretive, consistent with Mesopotamian divine legitimation patterns. In a museum, it is easy to forget that these texts were not meant for museums. They were meant for places where authority needed a visible backbone, courts, temples, scribal schools, archives. A prism is an object designed to be turned. Its four sides invite the reader or the student to rotate it to follow a continuous arrangement of names and claims. The act of turning becomes part of the learning. Kingship in Kish, kingship in Uruk, kingship in Ur, the sequence shifting like a procession of standards. That physical experience matters. It means this history was not simply read, it was handled, it was rehearsed. Temfidence, high for the prism's physicality and readability, medium for the educational emphasis, as a common context for such texts. And once you begin to hear the king list as a rehearsed structure, another question emerges quietly, almost against your will. What does a civilization do when it has inherited ruins? One answer is embedded in the king list's insistence on continuity. The flood is placed in the middle, but the list does not end there. It continues as though the world demanded that someone stand up after the erasure and say, kingship returned. Not merely that people survived, but that order survived, and that the right to rule, however it is understood, did not die with the drowned cities. The list's most important work may be this: it transforms catastrophe into a passage, not an extinction.
Evidence medium interpretive.
But there is another implication, one that the clay does not spell out, and yet seems to make unavoidable. If kingship can descend, then it can be withheld. If the flood can sweep over the entire world, as the text imagines it, then a city's walls, and a king's power, and a temple's rituals are not ultimately sufficient defences. They are practices of alignment. They are ways of persuading the cosmos to remain favourable. And when alignment fails, whether from human error, divine conflict, or the simple indifference of nature, the end can be recorded as a single sentence that needs no elaboration. Then the flood swept over. That line does not function like a memory of rain. It functions like a boundary stone in time. It divides existence into two legal territories, before and after. And as we move deeper into this investigation, we will have to consider how often Mesopotamian texts use similar boundaries, storms, decrees, curses, judgments to explain why a city can be present one moment and absent the next. Fimfidence, high for the textual boundary function, medium for the interpretive extension. For now, the prism remains under glass in Oxford, catalogued and measured, silent except for what its wedges preserve. It tells us that history, in the scribal tradition, is not primarily a tale of progress. It is a record of transfers, of kingship, of favour, of legitimacy, interrupted once by a flood that remade the world, and then somehow allowed the world to be rebuilt. And in that rebuilding, there is a quiet tension. If the flood is the hinge that divides time, what other hinges did the scribes recognise? What other moments when protection lifted, when judgment fell, when the world was made to start again? Names can be stable and still change. In the world that produced cuneiform, a divine name is rarely only a label. It is a category, a job description, sometimes even a court. When we say Anunnaki in modern speech, we often say it as if it points to a single, fixed group, unchanged, sharply defined, and consistently described across centuries. The tablets do not encourage that kind of certainty. What the evidence indicates, with high confidence, is that the word we render as Anunna or Anunnaki behaves like a title whose boundaries shift with time and genre. In one context, it can mean the gods of high standing, those of princely seed, as Assyriologists often translate the underlying Sumerian sense. In another context, especially in later literary framing, it can point downward toward the gods who sit in judgment, the powers associated with the underworld, the ones who do not negotiate but decide. The same word can travel between heaven and beneath the earth, and that movement alone should slow any attempt to build a single, rigid narrative around it. This is the first discipline of our investigation. Before we ask what war the Anunnaki fought, we have to ask what the name is allowed to mean. Can confidence high, based on Orac's scholarly framing of Anunna/Anunnaki as a category whose usage changes across corpora. A careful starting point is the scholarly synthesis offered by Orac's Ancient Mesopotamian Gods and Goddesses project, which treats Anunna, Anunnaki, not as a modern mythic headline, but as a lexical and textual problem. In that entry, the term is presented as a group designation rather than an individual deity, and its usage is tracked across periods and compositions. The entry notes that later usage sometimes contrasts the Anunna with the Igigi, dividing divine society into different assemblies, and it highlights a tendency, again not as a universal rule, but as a recurring pattern for Anunna to be used of underworld powers in certain contexts. This is not sensational, it is exactly the kind of small, sober observation that matters, because it means Anunnaki is not a single photograph, it is a file folder. If we bring that back to the title of our film, Sumerian texts reveal an Anunnaki war that erased civilizations overnight, we can begin to see where the real tension lives. Because when Mesopotamian texts speak of divine conflict, they do not always describe gods hurling weapons at one another in open sky. More often, the conflict appears as an argument over order. Who has the right to decree? Who has the right to judge? Who has the right to withdraw a city's protection? If the Anunna are functioning in some texts as judges, powers who decide rather than fight, then war can become a kind of legal violence. The erasure of a city can be framed not as the victory of an army, but as the outcome of a verdict. That is an alternative possibility, and it is only a possibility, but it fits a pattern we have already seen. The Flood Tablet's calm report of a divine plan, and the King List's single hinge line, then the flood swept over. Those texts do not demand a battlefield, they demand a decision. Confidence, medium, interpretive patterning, grounded in the way catastrophe is narrated in the flood tradition and King List framework. Here we need to keep our language precise. It is certain that Mesopotamian literature contains divine assemblies, decrees, and the idea that cities exist under divine protectorship. It is high confidence that the category name Anunnaki is not used in a single uniform way across time. It is medium confidence that the judge function, where the Anunna are framed as decisive powers, can shape how catastrophe is narrated, and it is low confidence to assert any single continuous storyline, one unbroken Anunnaki war, running cleanly from the earliest Sumerian city traditions to later copies and retellings. The evidence does not ask us to be simple. The name's ambiguity, however, does something valuable for an archaeologist. It forces us to listen for the difference between two kinds of speech inside the tablets, the speech of cosmology and the speech of memory. Cosmology uses divine groups to explain how the universe is structured, who rules, who judges, who serves. Memory uses divine groups to explain why a city fell, why prosperity withdrew, why famine arrived, why walls became rubble. When those two kinds of speech overlap, you can get a powerful illusion, a cosmic narrative that feels like a historical report. The scribes did not necessarily intend to deceive. They were doing something else, translating trauma into intelligible order. This is where the overnight sensation begins to make sense, without requiring that the actual destruction happened in a single night. A city can unravel slowly, harvest after harvest, debt after debt, neighbourhood after neighbourhood, and still be remembered as sudden, because what is remembered is the moment when protection was perceived to break. In Mesopotamian writing, that moment is often described as a switch being thrown, a decree issued, a god's heart turned away, a storm unleashed like a flood. The narrative compresses, the moral logic sharpens. The experience becomes, we were a city and then we were not. Confidence, medium, interpretive, consistent with the catastrophe as decree structure visible in the flood tradition and city ruin literature. If we keep the clay in view, the name Anunna becomes less of a mystery and more of a warning against modern certainty. Because the more you read these corpora responsibly, the more you notice that Mesopotamian theology is not built for our kind of categorization. The same group can be described as exalted in one genre, chthonic in another. A divine council can function as a legislative body in one text and as an underworld court in another. Even the difference between Sumerian and Akkadian spellings, Anunna, Anunnaku, Anunnaki, can signal shifts in period and scribal tradition. The name remains recognisably the same, but the function moves. Confidence high, grounded in Orosi's emphasis on the term as a category with changing usage. So, if we are going to speak of an Anunnaki war, we may have to accept that the war is not always pictured as combat. Sometimes it may be pictured as jurisdiction, the struggle over who decrees fate, the struggle over who may judge a city, the struggle over who has the authority to end what humans have built. And if that is the case, then the war would leave a very specific kind of trace in the tablets, not a record of arrows and siege engines, but a record of decisions phrased as cosmic necessity, a flood that must happen, a curse that cannot be lifted, a storm that arrives like the deluge and does not stop until it has done its work. In the next stage of our investigation, we move from definition to consequence. We leave the shifting name and turn toward a text that stages catastrophe as punishment with frightening clarity, a composition that does not simply describe a city's fall, but insists it was chosen. And when a fall is described as chosen, we are already standing at the edge of the thing the title calls war. Is it possible that what later generations imagined as divine conflict began, at least in part, as a human attempt to explain why cities can vanish, suddenly, finally, while the clay record survives? A city does not have to be taken by an enemy to be described as conquered. Sometimes, in the language of the tablets, a city falls because it is released from protection, released from order, released into the kind of silence that waits underneath human construction. When Mesopotamian scribes wanted to describe that kind of ending, they often reached for images that behave like law, not like weather, a pronouncement, a withdrawal, a turning of the divine face. The composition called The Cursing of Agade, also known as the Curse of Agade, stages catastrophe as something decided, not merely suffered, and it does so with a restraint that can feel colder than any shout. The version preserved in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature begins with prosperity, then pivots into judgment, as if the city's fortune were alone being called in. The Cursing of Agade, ETCSL 2.01.05. Confidence high. At first, Agade is pictured as a place where abundance is not accidental, but arranged. Holy Inanna establishes the city's sanctuary as her domain. The storehouses are filled, dwellings are founded, the people eat and drink splendidly, instruments sound, the harbour is full of joy. It is not simply a rich city, it is a city performing richness, displaying it, drawing foreign lands into its orbit as if tribute were a natural current. In the text's cadence, everything is in motion, but the motion is orderly, almost celebratory, like a procession that repeats each year without fear. The Cursing of Agade, ETCSL 2.01.05. Then comes a line that changes the temperature. The statement coming from the Ekur, the temple of Enlil in Nippur, is disquieting. The word does not explain itself. It doesn't say what the statement was, only what it did. It made Agade tremble. Terror befalls Inanna. And then, the most revealing move of all, Inanna abandons the sanctuary of Agade. She leaves as if leaving a household behind. Like a warrior hurrying to arms, the text says, she removes the gift of battle and fight from the city and hands it to the enemy. War, in this framing, begins as subtraction. It is not the enemy's strength that is emphasized, it is the city's loss of something that once protected it. The Cursing of Agade, ETCSL 2.01.05. The dismantling continues, and it is almost surgical. Not even 5 or 10 days have passed, and Ninurta brings back the jewels of rulership, the royal crown, the emblem, the royal throne that had been bestowed on Agade. Utu takes away the eloquence of the city. Enki takes away its wisdom, and lifts up into the midst of heaven the city's fearsomeness that once reached heaven. Enki tears out the well-anchored mooring pole from the Abzu. Inanna takes away its weapons. If you listen to these lines as an archaeologist, what stands out is how fully the text equates a city's survival with its invisible endowments: authority, speech, intelligence, dread radiance, anchoring, arms. The city is stripped before it is struck. The Cursing of Agade, ETCSL 2.01.05. Confidence, high. And then the poem offers a comparison that is as quiet as it is cruel. The life of Agade's sanctuary is brought to an end as if it had been only the life of a tiny carp in the deep waters. Civilizations are made small in one breath, not because the writer is careless, but because the writer is emphasizing the scale of what has decided against them. The city bends its neck to the ground like a mighty elephant. Like a dying dragon, it drags its head on the earth. And the humiliation is described as in a battle. Notice the tension. The text is willing to say battle, but the battle is not described with tactics. It is described as honour being taken away. The cursing of Agade, ECCSL 2.01.05. Confidence medium. If the flood tablet gave us catastrophe as a plan, and the king list gave us catastrophe as a hinge, the curse of Agade gives us catastrophe as a verdict with witnesses. Naram-Suin sees it first as a nocturnal vision, that Enlil will not let the kingdom of Agade occupy a lasting residence, that temples will shake, that treasures will be scattered. The king understands the dream, but does not speak it, and the silence feels like fear, the fear that language itself might make the doom more real. He performs extispacy, seeking an omen, and the omen has nothing to say. Twice it has nothing to say. The text does not present this as comfort, it presents it as abandonment. An official channel of meaning returns no answer. The cursing of a god, ETCSL 2.01.05. Confidence high. Then comes the moment that turns the story from lament into accusation. Naram-Suin mobilizes troops. He treats the Juguna, Enlil's sacred chamber, as if it were worth only 30 shekels. He sets ladders against the Eker. The poem describes the demolition in images of work, axes cast, double-edged axes sharpened, spades set against roots, the temple sinking as low as the foundation of the land, its top cut, its neck bowed like a dead soldier. Drain pipes are ripped out, and all the rain went back to the heavens. Gate names become targets. A gate from which grain is never diverted is made to divert grain, and the land is deprived of grain. A gate of well-being is struck, and well-being is subverted in all foreign lands. The point is not that a temple was damaged. The point is that the structure of stability, grain, rainfall, well-being was violated at its source. The cursing of Agade, a TCSL 2.01.05. Tempfidence high. And then the poem names the weapon that truly ends civilizations in Mesopotamian imagination. It calls Enlil the roaring storm that subjugates the entire land, and the rising deluge that cannot be confronted. The phrasing matters. It is not merely a storm, it is a storm with jurisdiction. And when Enlil considers what should be destroyed in return for the wrecking of the Aker, he does not need to lift a mace. He lifts his gaze toward the mountains and brings forth the Gutians, an unbridled people, not reckoned as part of the land, and they descend like small birds in great flocks. Messengers no longer travel highways, courier boats no longer pass along rivers, brigands occupy roads, gate doors lie dislodged in mud. In those details, collapse becomes visible as a system failure, transport, communication, security, agriculture. The poem moves from divine imagery to the hard texture of daily life. The cursing of Agade, ETCSL 2.01.05. Confidence high. The part that stays with you long after the mythic framing fades is the plain arithmetic of ruin. In those days, the poem says, oil for 1 shekel is only half a litre, grain for 1 shekel is only half a litre, wool for 1 shekel is only 1 minar, fish for 1 shekel fills only 1 ban measure. People die on rooftops. Those who lie down in houses are not buried. People flail at themselves from hunger. Dogs pack the silent streets. If 2 men walk there, they may be devoured. If 3 men walk there, they may be devoured. Noses are punched, heads are smashed, heads are sown like seeds. Heroes lie dead on heroes. Blood runs upon blood. The poem's images are severe, but the severity is not decorative. It is meant to feel irreversible. The Cursing of a God, ECSL 2.01.05. Timfidence, high. At this point, the title's phrase, erased entire civilizations overnight, can be handled responsibly, but only in a specific way. The poem does not claim that everything happened in a single night. In fact, it allows time. Naram-Suen persists for 7 years with the dream hanging over him. Yet it does claim that once protection is withdrawn, the descent can feel immediate. The world's functions stop, roads become hostile, markets become cruel, burial fails. When the system breaks, memory compresses. It becomes sudden, even when it took years to arrive. That is a medium confidence reading, and it fits the pattern we have been tracing. Catastrophe narrated as decree, not merely event. Now, we must bring the Anunnaki back into the room carefully. The Curse of a God is not a text that needs the word Anunnaki to describe divine authority. It already has Enlil, Inanna, Enki, An, Utu, Ninuta, named powers acting as if a council were dismantling the city piece by piece. The war here, if we call it war, resembles jurisdictional conflict, whose sanctuary is supreme, whose pronouncement stands, whose order remains binding. In that frame, divine war can look like a chain of administrative removals followed by storm and invasion, and the consequences are not cosmic in the abstract. They are written as bodies unburied, streets silent, prices unnatural. The Cursing of a God, ETCSL 2.01.05. Confidence medium. To keep our feet on physical ground, it helps to remember that this composition is not floating free in translation alone. Penn Museum's collections include a tiny fragment identified as a Curse of a God witness, tablet N6576, from Nippur Old Babylonian period, described as a literary text fragment of the Curse of a God tradition, tied to ETCSL 2.01.05, and a CD Lee composite Q000375. The fragment is small, only a few centimetres across, but that smallness is itself instructive. It tells us the composition circulated as school and archive material, copied and recopied, preserved in pieces, carried forward even when the city it described was already far behind the scribes in time. Penn Museum tablet N6576, provenience Nippur, identified as Curse of a God witness.
Avance high.
So, if we return to our guiding thesis, divine conflict as a scribal memory of abrupt collapse, we can say this much with high confidence. The Curse of a God describes a city's end as a decision enacted through the withdrawal of gifts, the unleashing of storm imagery, and the breakdown of social systems. We can say with medium confidence that this style of writing, by compressing causality into a decree, can make collapse feel overnight in memory. And we can say with low confidence, for now, that any single group name, Anunna or Anunnaki, can fully explain what the poem is doing, because the poem's authority is distributed across named gods rather than a single label. The poem ends by praising Inanna for the destruction of Agade. That closing line is not triumphal. It feels like a seal placed on a verdict, final, unemotional, complete. And once a verdict is sealed in clay, it becomes something later generations can inherit, even if they do not know the full story that led to it. If a city can be dismantled by removals before it is struck by enemies, what would it look like in the next text we examine, when the battle is not against a city at all, but against a mountain, and the language of combat begins to resemble the language of cosmic judgment? The texts do not always place catastrophe inside a city. Sometimes they move the struggle to the edge of the human world, to the place where the plain rises into rock and shadow, where a road narrows, where water is harder to find, where a boundary is not drawn in ink or clay, but in elevation and fear. In Sumerian imagination, mountains are never only scenery. They can be adversaries. They can be barriers that refuse submission. They can be places where divine authority is tested, and where the language of war becomes a language of order being enforced. The composition called Inanna and Ebi survives as a scholarly composite. CDLI Literary 00339, composite number Q00339, reconstructed from many old Babylonian manuscripts. What matters for us is not only the poem's plot, but the way it speaks about refusal and retaliation, how a mountain becomes guilty, how punishment becomes justified, how violence becomes clean in the mouth of a deity. Diddley's composite for Inanna and Ebi preserves repeated phrases of defiance, preparation and striking, an insistence that the conflict is not accidental, but chosen, staged and completed as a kind of demonstration. C.D. Lee, composite Q000339, Inanna and Ebi. The poem's setting is already telling. A mountain, Ebi, stands as something that will not bow, and that refusal is treated as an offence. The text frames the mountain not as inert stone, but as a presence with neck, mouth and posture, capable of disrespect. In this world, disrespect is not merely social, it is cosmic. If a mountain does not acknowledge Inanna, then it is not simply a mountain, it is a breach in the hierarchy that keeps heaven and earth aligned. We have to speak carefully about confidence here. It is certain that Inanna and Ebi exists as a documented Sumerian literary composition in the major scholarly corpora, and that C.D. Lie's composite Q000339 preserves the structure and language of the story across witnesses. It is high confidence that the poem portrays violent subjugation as the restoration of order. It is medium confidence to treat the mountain as a symbol that can carry multiple reference, geographic, political and mythic, because the text itself does not pin the mountain down for us in modern terms. And it is low confidence to insist that the poem is a disguised report of any single historical campaign. The safest reading begins with what the lines do. They construct legitimacy for overwhelming force. In C.D. Lee's composite transliteration, the poem includes explicit lines where Anunna speaks of herself and the divine assembly around her, and a key phrase appears in that setting, Danunnaki Forni, the Anunna. The line sits in a section where the poem intensifies, as if to say that what is about to happen is not a private act of rage, but an act framed within divine society. In that sense, the poem allows us to place the Anunna near the moment of decision and action, not as a modern slogan, but as a presence within the narrative's machinery of authority. C.D. Lee, composite Q000339, Inanna and Ebi Mine with Danunnaki Forni in the preserved composite. And yet, even here, the poem does something that should sound familiar by now. It does not merely describe striking. It describes preparation as a kind of ritual. There are lines of taking up weapons, of setting the stance, of arranging the conditions under which the blow will be justified. The violence is presented as an extension of rightful power. The mountain is described as refusing, and Inanna as responding in a way that becomes inevitable once refusal is established. This is not chaotic violence. It is violence with a legal shape. From an investigative archaeologist's point of view, that is the detail that matters most. Because when later scribes speak of cities erased by storm or curse, the pattern is often the same. First comes the withdrawal of favour, then the removal of protections, then the unleashed force, then the silent landscape afterward. Inanna and Ebi relocates that pattern onto a mountain, but the logic is shared. The poem is a demonstration of what happens when a powerful entity is framed as non-compliant with cosmic order. Its fall becomes necessary, and the narrative is written to make that necessity feel clean. If the title of our film speaks of an Anunnaki war, this composition offers one careful possibility. Not that the Anunna are named as soldiers with banners, but that divine assemblies and divine categories sit behind moments of sanctioned destruction. In the poem's framing, the mountain is not merely defeated, it is corrected. The act of correction is the heart of this kind of war. the kind that erases by decree, not merely by blade. We can anchor this sense of scribal transmission to the physical world through what museums hold. At the Penn Museum, the object catalogued as CBS 13819, provenience to Nippur, dated to the year 3 period, and recorded as coming from the west side of the Shat Enlil within a temple archive, survives as a small administrative fragment. Only 2 lines. It is not by itself the literary poem, but it matters because it reminds us where these worlds overlap. Nippur is not only the setting of kingship lists and flood tablets, it is also an archive city where countless small texts, administrative and literary, were stored, copied and preserved in the same cultural ecosystem. Penn Museum CBS 13819, Nippur, Temple Archive Provenience. And nearby in the Penn Museum's holdings, another Nippur tablet offers a second reminder, CBS 1465, listed with Locust Temple Library, is an old Babylonian literary text fragment with an extensive description, proof that Nippur's temple contexts preserved both the practical paperwork of institutions and the longer compositions that shaped how institutions imagined their gods and their world. Penn Museum CBS 10465, Nippur, Temple Library Locus. This is how war becomes durable in clay, not as a headline, but as a model of how reality behaves. A mountain refuses, a goddess prepares, a divine assembly is implied, the blow falls, order is restored, and the narrative becomes teachable, copyable, portable across centuries. And if that model can be applied to a mountain, it can also be applied to a city. A city refuses, a sanctuary is violated, gifts are withdrawn, storm and invasion arrive. The city becomes a ruined mound where foxes brush their tails through abandoned pens, as the curse of a god he imagines. The mechanism is the same, refusal first, then sanctioned destruction. So the quiet question for the night is this: when Sumerian texts frame annihilation as the correction of disorder, whether the target is a mountain or a city, are we hearing myth alone, or are we hearing a cultural memory of how quickly the built world can be returned to silence once? Protection is believed to have been lifted. There is a particular kind of violence that does not feel like hatred, it feels like procedure. In the Sumerian composition commonly called Ninurta's exploits, known also by its incipient tradition as Lugale, the hero god Ninurta does not simply fight. He adjudicates, he classifies, he restores a damaged world by treating conflict as a problem of cosmic order, as if battle were only the visible surface of a deeper administrative act. The text survives as a composite in the major scholarly corpora. In CD-Li, it is preserved as a literary composite under CD-Li Literary 000351, the work we have been following in outline as the evidence base for this chapter. The electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature presents the composition as the exploits of Ninurta, ETCSL 1.6.2, and from its opening lines the voice is explicit about what kind of figure Ninurta is meant to be: storm, deluge, battlenet, and also the one whose orders are unalterable and whose decisions are faithfully executed. ETCSL 1.6.2, the exploits of Ninurta. And then, very early, we are given a scene that should slow us down. Ninurta is not introduced in motion. He is introduced seated. In a setting that resembles a court as much as a feast, he sits on a throne dais at a festival celebrated in his honour, and the text says that he is handing down decisions. In other words, the poem does not separate warfare from judgment. It makes judgment the posture that precedes warfare. ETCSL 1.6.2, the exploits of Ninurta. Then the crisis is announced. A monstrous opponent, a Sug, is described as coming out of the mountains, spreading its domain, raiding cities, and even doing something that is nearly a parody of sovereignty. It actually decides the land's lawsuits, just as you do, the report tells Ninurta. That line matters because it frames the coming violence not merely as defence of cities, but as defence of jurisdiction. The enemy is not only a threat to bodies, it is a threat to the very right to decide what reality will be. ETCSL 1.6. 2. The exploits of Ninurta. At this point, the poem does what Mesopotamian texts often do when catastrophe begins. It records a reaction that is social, not human society first, but divine society. The translation says, "That day the earth became dark, the Anunna trembled." Then, even more quietly, it says that the gods disperse, and the Anunna disappeared over the horizon like sheep. This is not a small detail. It suggests that the Anunna, those gods of high standing who can also appear as a council, are not framed here as eager warriors. They are framed as witnesses to a crisis that shakes even the divine order, and their disappearance marks the seriousness of what has broken loose. ETCSL 1.6.2. The exploits of Ninurta. This is where the title's phrase Anunnaki War must be handled with precision, because if we are listening closely, the poem does not demand that we picture a simple heavenly battle between gods. What it gives us, instead, is the collapse of a system of governance. An enemy arises that usurps judgment, the divine assembly recoils, the world darkens, and then Ninurta moves, not as a private avenger, but as the agent who can reimpose order by force. The war becomes the enforcement arm of a threatened legal cosmos. Evidence medium. When Ninurta goes to battle, the poem leans into storm language so heavily that it begins to feel less like metaphor and more like a category of action. He rides on winds, he causes dust to rise and settle, he overturns trees, he fills holes. The text speaks of coals, flaming fires, forests reduced to heaps, and the Tigris becoming muddied and disturbed. Birds try to fly, but their wings trail on the ground. Fish are flooded out in the subterranean waters and snap at the air. Animals of the open country are reduced to firewood, roasted like locusts. The composition calls it a deluge, rising and disastrously ruining the mountains. ETCSL 1.6.2. The exploits of Ninurta. Notice what the poem is doing. It makes battle indistinguishable from environmental catastrophe. And that matters because it gives us a bridge between genres. In the Flood tablet, storm and flood erase humanity by decision. In the King list, the flood swept over becomes a hinge in time. In the Curse of Agade, Enlil is described as a storm that subjugates the land, a deluge that cannot be confronted. And here, in Ninurta's exploits, the hero himself is framed as deluge, as storm, as the instrument by which order is restored, yet the restoration is violent enough to turn the world black. TCSL 1.6.2, Penn Museum Flood Tablet CBS 10673, B10673, Nipple. Confidence high. Then comes one of the most revealing sequences in the entire composition. After the great enemy is overcome, the poem shifts from killing to classification. Ninurta begins to fix destinies for the entities that fought against him. Stones, materials, named substances, assigning them roles, values, and functions in the world. Some are cursed, diminished, made contemptible. Others are given honourable uses, destined for statues, tools, ritual settings. It is as if the battlefield has become an archive, and the archive must be organised so the world can continue. ETCSL 1.6.2, passages on Ninurta fixing destinies of stones. This is where the judge aspect becomes unmistakable. The same figure who unleashes a storm also determines the place of matter itself in the restored order. Violence and bureaucracy are not separate. They are part of the same worldview. When chaos rises, it must be subdued. When it is subdued, it must be assigned a place so it cannot rise in the same way again. Confidence, medium, and there is an aftershock that the poem does not hide. It says that at a certain time, the good water coming forth from the earth did not pour down over the fields, cold water was piled up. The Tigris did not bring up its flood in fullness. Offerings are not brought, famine is hard. Canals are not cleaned, ditch making does not exist, people do not. Work furrows, barley is sown broadcast. In other words, even after the heroic victory, the world is not immediately stable. The poem allows a period of dysfunction, an interval where the systems that make civilization possible are suspended. ETSL 1.6.2, post-battle disruption passages. Then Ninurta applies wisdom and performs restoration as engineering. He makes a pile of stones in the mountains. He bars the front of the land with a great wall. He installs a sluice on the horizon. He gathers dispersed waters and leads them down to the Tigris. He pours carp floods over fields. This is not simply mythic triumph. It is mythic infrastructure, an explanation for why rivers flood and why fields can be watered, written as the aftermath of a cosmic war. ETCSL 1.6.2, Ninurta's water control and restoration passages. If you listen to this slowly, the logic is almost haunting. War causes disruption of water and agriculture. Restoration requires controlling water and re-establishing agriculture. That is exactly the kind of linkage an archaeologist learns to respect, because the ancient world could be undone by failures in irrigation systems, in labour organisation, in the maintenance of canals and embankments. The poem gives that vulnerability a divine narrative form. Now, a quiet complication. The Ninurta tradition does not exist in isolation. The name Ninurta is also tied to the Anzu narrative in later Mesopotamian corpora, where a monstrous being steals the Tablet of Destinies and threatens the cosmic order. Orak's Nimrud project describes the mythic logic clearly. Ninurta defeats Anzu and reclaims the Tablet of Destinies, the record of the gods' decisions about the future. The story is framed as a marriage of militarism and scholarly learning, intelligence and force used together to restore rightful authority. Orak, Anzu the monstrous lion eagle, Nimrud project. We do not need to chase every later variation to hear what matters for this chapter. The recurring pattern is that war is not merely physical. It is about who holds the right to decree. When that right is stolen or usurped, the world destabilizes. When it is restored, the world can be made governable again. That is the kind of Anunnaki war that could be preserved in scribal memory without ever needing to describe gods trading blows like soldiers. It is a war over jurisdiction, and the visible consequences are storm, famine, and silence. Evidence medium. To keep this grounded in real objects and real proveniences, we can look again toward Nippur. Penn Museum holds an old Babylonian literary fragment N7337, provenienced to Nippur, identified as part of the Ninurta tradition, Ninurta and the Turtle, with ECSL 1.06.03 and CDLI composite Q000352 noted in its description. It is only 4 lines, but that is exactly the point. These traditions circulated in pieces, in school and archive contexts, as small recoverable units of a larger cultural memory. Penn Museum N7337, Nippur, Old Babylonian Literary Fragment. And in the British Museum, we can glimpse another axis of the Ninurta tradition's afterlife, a large tablet from the library tradition at Koyunjik, registration 1929,112.29, part of a very large tablet of the Tukulti Ninurta Epic, Middle Assyrian, from Nineveh. Even without turning this into a new branch of the story, the presence of Ninurta material in later libraries underlines the longevity of the idea that the proper ruler is one who fights and judges, who restores order and inscribes it. British Museum Tablet 1929,112.29 Koyunjik. So, where does this leave our core thesis? With high confidence, Ninurta's exploits gives us a template where catastrophic violence is framed as the reassertion of cosmic and legal order, and where the Anunna appear not as simple warriors, but as divine society shaken by crisis. With medium confidence, the poem's storm and deluge language shows how war can be narrated as an overwhelming natural force, making the destruction of communities feel sudden, total, and beyond human resistance. And with low confidence, at this stage, we can ask whether such mythic templates preserved faint memories of real system collapses, famine, canal failure, political fragmentation, reimagined as divine conflict. The next step in our outline returns us to a quieter kind of erasure, one that does not require a battlefield at all, only a boat, a storm, and a decision that cannot be confronted. If the world can be undone by a flood and restored by decree, what happens when the same story is told twice, once in Sumerian, once in later copies, and the differences between the two become their own kind of evidence? Night is not the dramatic hour we imagine in later stories. In the oldest archives, night is administrative. It is when the city lowers its voice, when lamps reduce their flame, and when the canal water becomes a darker mirror. It is also when a civilization can be made to feel fragile, not because an army arrives at the gate, but because the rules holding the world together can be revised. If we want to approach the phrase erased overnight responsibly, we have to let the tablets teach us what erasure means in their own grammar. In these texts, destruction is rarely narrated like a battle report. It is narrated like a decision carried out through systems, wind, water, time, and the removal of protection. One object makes that method visible in a way that is almost uncomfortable in its calm. In the Penn Museum's Middle East galleries there is a flood tablet known as CBS 1673, exhibited as B1673, a baked clay tablet from Nippur in Iraq. Its script places it in the Old Babylonian period, around 1650 BC, and it preserves only the lower third. 6 columns of text remain, 3 on each side, about 10 to 15 lines per preserved column, with a complete tablet estimated at roughly 260 lines. The museum records note that CBS 1673 is joined with CBS 1867, as if even the physical object is teaching us that memory survives in recombined fragments. And on the catalogue trail, the same piece lives under CD line number P265876, as a witness to the flood story composite known as Q00357. The first thing the tablet tells us is not the flood. The first thing it tells us is order. Before any waters rise, the world is described as a network of founded places, cities built under divine patronage. The way it speaks is almost municipal. The point is not scenery, but structure, cities, rulers, duties, and a sense that civilization is something established and maintained, not simply there. In this register, human life is not merely breathing and eating. It is the existence of temples, decisions, names, and boundaries. Then the tone shifts, not into rage, but into inevitability. The plan to end humanity arrives not as a rumour from the street, but as a matter that has already been decided in the Council of the Gods. And the mechanism of this story, what makes it feel like war even without armies, is that the decision is enforced by changing the conditions under which cities can continue. It is the removal of a world's permission to persist. This is where the name Ziusudra matters. In the Sumerian flood tradition, preserved on CBS 18673, Ziusudra is not introduced as a warrior. He is introduced as a point of continuity, someone who receives knowledge before the system collapses. The god Enki appears here as a figure who does not simply fight the decision, but works sideways through it, revealing, warning, instructing, protecting. The tablet's own description, in the Penn Museum's catalogue language, makes it plain. Enki reveals the plan to destroy humanity by flood to Ziusudra, and what follows is wind, storms, and an operational duration, 7 days and 7 nights. 7 days and 7 nights is not a poetic flourish when you hear it the way a scribe would hear it. It is a measurement. It makes the flood feel like a scheduled force, long enough to erase visible order, short enough that order itself can still be rebuilt afterward. This is one of the quiet shocks of the text. Catastrophe is not chaotic. Catastrophe is executed, and in that execution, overnight becomes a kind of memory compression. We should be careful here. Cities do not die in a single night in the archaeological sense. Even burned layers represent hours of violence sitting on top of years of tension. But in literature, the mind often records collapse as sudden, because it is the moment the last stabilizing assumption breaks. The day before, the city is still itself. The day after, the city is no longer legible as a city. The tablet gives us the literary version of that hinge, a hinge that feels instantaneous, because the story is designed to explain why the world after can no longer recognize the world before. When the waters finally arrive, the narrative does not linger on panic. It moves through forces, wind, storm, flood, like a ledger of elements doing what they were told. And when the flood ends, the story does not present a triumphant victory scene. It presents a restoration process. The sun returns. The survivor makes offerings. The divine realm responds. And then, in one of the most revealing moves, An and Enlil grant Ziusudra eternal life. That detail is not just a reward, it is a structural repair. If the world has been reset, the archive needs one living link to certify the continuity of meaning. Immortality is the narrative tool that keeps testimony alive across the rupture. Now we have to place that beside a second witness, one that is later in date and language, but openly preserves the same flood architecture. In the British Museum's collection, there is a clay tablet catalogued as K3375, the flood tablet from Tablet C of the Epic of Gilgamesh, from the Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. This is a Neo-Assyrian copy in Akkadian, dated broadly to the 7th century BC. The name of the flood survivor in this tradition is Utnapishtim. The language is different. The cultural moment is later. But the mechanics, divine decision, warning, vessel, storm, survival, post-flood offering, and the awarding of a kind of life beyond life remain recognisable. In the British Museum's own collection description, K3375 is identified as a tablet with 2 columns of inscription on either side, preserving the flood narrative as part of the larger epic sequence. What matters for our investigation is not to pretend these 2 tablets are identical. They are not. They belong to different centuries, different scribal schools, different political worlds. But when a later library copy preserves the same skeleton of catastrophe, it becomes a kind of witness to durability. This is how Mesopotamian tradition remembered the possibility of total erasure, and also how it remembered survival as a legal exception. And once you see that, the idea of Anunnaki war changes shape, because in these flood narratives, the gods are not described as charging across a plain. They are described as deciding. They are described as withdrawing protection. They are described as implementing a verdict through nature. That aligns with what Iraq's ancient Mesopotamian gods and goddesses project says about the Anunnaki. In the Sumerian corpus, Anunnaki can designate the highest gods, and one of their main functions is to decide fates. In other words, the war may not be a war of weapons, but a war of jurisdiction over who gets to define whether cities continue. That possibility is especially important because it keeps us honest. It prevents us from turning a flood tablet into a science fiction scene. It returns us to the real uncomfortable power of these texts. They describe civilization as something granted, something organised, and something that can be rescinded. There is another detail on Penn Museum's flood tablet CBS 10673 that I keep returning to, because it quietly anchors everything. The tablet is not a smooth, complete narrative artifact. It is a fragment, the lower third of a larger composition, surviving with 6 columns preserved out of what would have been a far longer text. The museum estimates around 260 lines for the complete tablet, and what we hold now is only the remainder. That is the true after the flood condition. Not simply that the world is rebuilt, but that knowledge becomes partial. Memory becomes a set of surviving surfaces. And the work of the investigator, our work, is to notice how traditions preserve the mechanics of erasure even when the details are broken. So when we say erased overnight, we should say it the way the tablets push us to say it. Not as spectacle, as procedure. A decision is made in the divine realm. A warning is transmitted along a narrow channel. A duration is specified, 7 days, and 7 nights. The physical world becomes the instrument, and afterward a survivor is granted a kind of permanence, not so that the story can become mythic entertainment, but so that the rupture can be explained without making the universe meaningless. And once we see that, we are ready for the next question, the quieter one. If some catastrophes are carried out like decrees, then what does it mean when a city falls as if by decision, even without floodwaters, when a curse, a withdrawal, or a divine verdict functions like siege, but leaves no enemy to blame? There are objects that carry a story the way a tablet carries a text, line by line, carefully, almost privately. And then there are objects that carry a story the way a city gate carries a message, openly, publicly, built to be seen, built to endure. This chapter begins with one of those public objects. In the Louvre's Department of Near Eastern Antiquities, on display, there is a silver vessel recorded as the vase of Emetena, also known in older publications as the vase d'Entemena, catalogued as AO 2674, discovered at Gyursu, the site also called Tello. The Louvre dates it to the early dynastic Ib period, around 2420 to 2400 BCA, and describes it as a complete object. A hammered silver vase on a copper base formed as 4 lion claws, standing about 35 centimetres high and about 18 centimetres across. The decoration is arranged as if it were meant to be read, a frieze of 7 reclining heifers, and above them a repeated image of the Imdugud, lion-headed eagles, gripping alternating pairs of lions and goats 4 times around the vessel, with a Sumerian cuneiform dedication running in a vertical column on the neck. In the Louvre's own description of that inscription, it states that the vase belonged to the table service of Ningirsu, the god of Lagash, and it preserves the name of a priest, Dudu, inside that devotional record. Now, step back from the glass case and let the object tell you what it is doing. It is not a battle narrative. It is not a lament. It is not a flood story. It is something older and in a way more revealing. It is a claim that a world can be stabilised. Because a dedication like this is not merely an offering. It is a method for making memory heavy. Silver is not chosen for convenience. Silver is chosen because it holds value across time, because it resists decay better than many organic materials, because it declares that what is being said here, this relationship between ruler, temple and god, should not be easily undone. The copper base, shaped like lion claws, does the same thing in image form. A lion's claw is not a gentle symbol. It is a reminder that protection, in the Mesopotamian imagination, is never simply passive. It is something that can seize. And then the imagery repeats again and again around the vase, like a refrain. The Imdugod, lion-headed eagle, is not placed here to entertain the eye. It is placed here to anchor authority in a supernatural register. It grips animals the way a power structure grips the life of a city, holding prey, holding tribute, holding the boundary between inside and outside. Meanwhile, the heifers below are calm, reclining, numerous. Their stillness suggests abundance, herds, continuity, life that is meant to reproduce itself quietly year after year. So the vase carries 2 messages at once. First, we have plenty, we have order, we have herds and seasons, and the routine of food set before a god. Second, this order is held in place. It is protected by force, by a cosmic animal that does not negotiate. This is where the vase becomes relevant to our larger investigation into erased civilizations overnight. Because the fear that a city can vanish does not begin with sensational stories. It begins with the daily knowledge that cities are fragile systems dependent on water, harvests, trade routes, alliances, and the continued favour of whatever powers people believe govern the world. And when people live with that fragility long enough, they begin to build objects that argue against it. A tablet can be buried and forgotten, but a ceremonial vessel placed into the service of a god, named, inscribed, displayed, tries to turn the city into something more permanent than its walls. It tries to make the city part of divine routine. That is why the inscription matters so much. The Louvre characterises the text as a dedication, a votive inscription written in Sumerian cuneiform. In other words, it is designed to be read as a formal act, not as a private thought. It gives the vase a legal and religious identity. It identifies ownership and service. This belongs to Ningasu's table. And by placing a ruler's action inside that service, it suggests a chain of legitimacy. The city's prosperity is tied to correct offering, correct naming, correct placement of wealth into divine hands. If chapter 7 showed us erasure as procedure, 7 days, 7 nights, then this phase shows us the opposite impulse, permanence as procedure. A city does not only defend itself with weapons, it defends itself with records, with offerings, with the right objects in the right places, bearing the right names, with a visible claim that says, we belong to a God who can hold the world steady. And there is one more quiet detail that matters, if you let it land slowly. The vase is complete. So many Mesopotamian stories reach us broken. Lower thirds of tablets, missing columns, shattered edges, joined fragments. The Penn Museum's flood tablet is literally a surviving portion, joined with another piece, a story held together by reconstruction. But this object, AO 2674, is described as complete. It stands as an intact statement from the 3rd millennium BC. That completeness is not just good luck. It is the thing the object was made to achieve. It was meant to outlast a single reign. It was meant to survive a change of officials, a change of seasons, even a change in the city's fortunes. It was meant to carry a name forward, Enmetina, and to place that name in the orbit of Ningirsu, where it could be repeated without being rewritten. So when we talk about erased civilizations, we should also talk about the technologies people used to resist erasure. Not only writing on clay, but writing on wealth. Not only stories of catastrophe, but objects built as counterspells against forgetting. And that returns us to the larger question running beneath this entire series. When a text later speaks of sudden endings, of floods, of curses, of days when order collapses, what survives is never just the event. What survives is the attempt to make meaning hold. In the next chapter, we move from this public, gleaming argument for continuity back into the quieter world of clay again, into the rebuilding mindset, into the decisions that follow rupture, into the way rulers present restoration, not as improvisation, but as obedience to a plan. After catastrophe, there are 2 kinds of silence. One is the silence of abandonment, ruins settling, canals choking, names no longer spoken aloud. The other is the silence before reconstruction, when a city still stands, but the people inside it are no longer sure which rules still apply. This chapter lives in that second silence, and it is anchored in 2 objects that were made to hold a rebuilding program in place, not for one season, but for generations. In the Louvre's department of Near Eastern Antiquities, there are 2 monumental terracotta cylinders known as Gudea Cylinder A and Gudea Cylinder B. The Louvre catalogues them as MMB 1512 and MMB 1511 and dates them to the Neo-Sumerian period under Gudea, around 2120 to 2110. Both were discovered at Tello, ancient Jesu, and both are written in Sumerian cuneiform. The Louvre describes Cylinder A as a cylinder with 30 columns of inscription, and Cylinder B as a cylinder with 24 columns. These are not short dedications, they are long-form memory. They are the kind of inscription that does not merely praise a ruler, but tries to define what restoration is supposed to mean. And what they show in their calm architecture is that in Mesopotamian thought, rebuilding is not simply a human decision. It is a negotiation with the divine order of the world. Cylinder A, in the Louvre's own summary of its content, describes a decision formulated for Ningirsu by the sovereign god Enlil. A temple is to be built in the city, because a prince of wide intelligence will apply that intelligence to the work. Ningirsu manifests to Gadir in a dream, speaks of the temple, specifies his desires, dictates his will, and even describes what the completed sanctuary will do. Listen closely to what that implies. The catastrophe, whatever it was in lived experience, is not treated as the final word. The final word belongs to order, and order is restored through correct building. This is not the mood of a battlefield. It is the mood of a blueprint. And the blueprint is not only architectural, it is social, it is economic, it is ritual. It tells you how a city is supposed to recover by aligning the human world with a divine plan so precisely that abundance returns as if it were the natural consequence of correct design. The Louvre summary is unusually vivid here. It says the text describes how, once the decision is made, materials converge toward Lagash from far distances: wood, metals, bitumen, blocks of stone, things that Sumer itself, as an agricultural land, does not possess in abundance. And then, after purification of the city and its inhabitants, Gadir begins the work and raises a majestic temple to his god. That sequence matters. Decision, instruction, gathering, purification, construction. It reads almost like a ritualized supply chain. So if we are tracing an Anunnaki war in a responsible way, without turning it into spectacle, this is one of our strongest clues about how Mesopotamian texts process violence. They often translate rupture into a problem of alignment. The world goes out of joint, and the remedy is to put it back into joint by rebuilding the proper relationship between city and deity. Cylinder B continues that worldview, but it shifts the lens. According to the Louvre's description, the text of Cylinder B explains that the god will now live in the sanctuary with his spouse, and that at each new year, through the ceremony of the sacred marriage, the world's birth is renewed and the sun is set in motion for a new annual course. The cylinder then describes how Gadir installs around Ningirsu a whole ecosystem of servants, divine and human, responsible for the services of the table, of war, of agriculture, of fisheries, of building, extending their offices out to the borders of the state, the meadows, the marshes, the fields. That list is the quiet key, because war here is not treated as a random emergency. It becomes one of the managed services of a functioning temple state, like agriculture, like fisheries, like building. In other words, violence is not outside civilization. It is one of the forces civilization must organize. And then Cylinder B states, in the Louvre summary, a line that almost feels like a thesis statement for the entire Sumerian recovery mindset for the Sumerians: the temple lives less from the country than the country lives and profits from the temple. And it adds that, as Ningirsu tells Gadir explicitly, thanks to the establishment of the temple, abundance will come, the great fields will be fertile, canals and ditches will be filled to the brim, in Sumer abundant oil will flow, and overabundant wool will pile up. In other words, the temple is framed as infrastructure, not only spiritual infrastructure, material infrastructure. The temple is the device that regulates water, labour, food, and the predictability of seasons. Now let's place that beside what we've already seen in earlier chapters. In the flood tradition preserved on the Penn Museum's flood tablet CBS 10673, exhibited as BWEN 673 from Nippur, the erasure of the old world happens through wind and water over 7 days and 7 nights, and then life resumes through sacrifice and renewed order. In the King List tradition, on the Well-Blundell Prism, Ashmolean Museum, AN 1923. 444, the flood is a hinge sentence, the flood swept over, and then kingship descended from heaven again. In the curse tradition, like the composition known as the Cursing of Agade in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, ETCSL 2.01.05, the collapse of a city is described as the removal of gifts, weapons taken away, wisdom taken away, gates subverted, rain withheld, canals turning brackish. These are different genres, different angles, but they share a common logic. Erasure and restoration are treated as changes in a city's relationship to the forces that govern reality, whether those forces are gods, decrees, or the systems of water and grain that make life possible. So Goudier's cylinders don't just tell us a temple was built, they tell us how a civilization tries to heal itself after rupture without admitting that the world is random. They assert that the world is governable if the right rules are restored. That is why these cylinders are so important to our larger investigation. Because if we use the phrase erased overnight, the honest response is, yes, memory can compress collapse into suddenness. Yes, text can represent disaster as a single verdict. But in the same breath, the tradition insists that restoration is possible through planning, purity, and the rebuilding of institutions. And if an Anunnaki war exists anywhere in this story, these cylinders suggest it would not necessarily look like spears and chariots. It could look like jurisdiction. It could look like the right to decide whether canals run, whether fields bear, whether the sun's annual course is renewed, whether abundance returns, whether a city remains legible as a city, which leads us to a quiet and unsettling question. If the temple is described as the mechanism that keeps the world fertile and stable, then what does it mean archaeologically, socially and textually when we find layers where cities burned, walls collapsed, and daily life was sealed under debris, as if people did not have time to tidy the room before they vanished? There is a certain kind of destruction that archaeologists recognise not with excitement, but with quiet caution. It is not a story in the usual sense. It is a condition. A room collapses and seals what was inside. A wall falls outward and stays where it landed. A floor is littered with objects that were never gathered up. And above it all, there is the same dark signature: burnt debris, carbon, reddened earth, ash, what we often call a burn layer. When we speak about civilizations erased overnight, the burn layer is one of the few places where that phrase can be tested against something physical, not proved, not disproved, tested, because a burn layer is the material trace of time compressed. It is a moment that became a surface. In the far northeast of modern Syria, near the Iraqi border, there is a site called Hammokar. Archaeologists working there described an episode of violent destruction around 3500 BCE, a mid-4th millennium context. In a joint announcement circulated through phys.org, Clemens Reichel of the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago described excavated areas as a war zone with collapsed walls that had undergone heavy bombardment by sling bullets and then collapsed in an ensuing fire. The same report describes more than 1,200 smaller oval sling bullets, roughly an inch long, and about 120 larger round clay balls, roughly 2.5 to 4 inches in diameter, recovered from the destruction context, projectiles and debris left in place, as if the event overtook daily life, rather than unfolding slowly enough to tidy up after it. This is not a myth. It is not a tablet. It is a layer of earth, and it behaves like a testimony. And yet even here, where the evidence is physical and immediate, the honest interpretation remains restrained. A burn layer does not tell you who felt righteous. It does not tell you which god was blamed. It does not tell you the speeches that were made afterward. It tells you something narrower and more valuable, that destruction happened in a way that left little time for the ordinary rituals of closing a house. No careful removal of valuables, no sweeping, no orderly abandonment. In archaeology, we sometimes call such deposits frozen contexts, because the violence creates a kind of accidental archive. The phys.org report uses that same idea, noting that ancient warfare can bury what was in buildings literally waiting to be retrieved, and that these frozen contexts help identify domestic spaces, cooking facilities, production sites, or administrative and religious buildings. Now set that beside the way Sumerian texts talk about sudden endings. On the Penn Museum's flood tablet CBS 12673, exhibited as Bedtime 673 from Nippur, written in Sumerian and dated by script to around 1650 BCE, the flood lasts 7 days and 7 nights. It is narrated as a clean operational duration, not as chaos. That tablet preserves only the lower third, 6 columns of text, and yet it still carries the calm administrative feeling of a world being switched off and switched on again, ending with Yasudra emerging and offering sacrifices, and then receiving eternal life from An and Enlil once Enki has. Mollified the fury. The key difference is obvious. Hamakar is not a flood narrative. Hamakar is fire, collapse, and projectiles. But the similarity is more subtle. Both are about systems failing quickly enough that the aftermath becomes a sealed record. In Sumerian literature, the sudden ending is often described as a withdrawal of stability, rain withheld, grain diverted, gates ruined, roads no longer travelled. In the composition known as the Cursing of Agade, preserved in the Old Babylonian version through the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, ETCSL 2.1.05, the text describes Inanna abandoning Agade, removing the gift of battle, and handing it to the enemy. Then, not even 5 or 10 days later, the story describes a stripping away of civic capacities. Ninurta bringing back the crown and throne, Utu taking away the city's eloquence, Enki taking away its wisdom, An taking up its fearsomeness into heaven, and Enki tearing out its holy mooring pole from the Abzu. Whether we read that as theology, political memory, or literary design, the pattern is consistent. Catastrophe is described as the removal of what makes a city function. Archaeology cannot confirm the gods, but it can confirm fragility. What the burn layer teaches at Hamakar and at other northern sites often discussed alongside it, such as Tel Brak, is that early urban life already carried within it the possibility of rapid collapse. Walls can be breached, storage can be seized, buildings can burn with their contents inside, and once you accept that, the Mesopotamian literary obsession with sudden endings becomes less strange. It starts to look like a cultural response to a real structural truth: cities are complex, and complexity is vulnerable. The Phys.org report describes Hamakar as having distinctly urban features in the mid-4th millennium, large building complexes around courtyards, a large kitchen with grinding stones embedded in benches, and a baking oven large enough to fill a room, suggesting food production beyond a single household. It also describes stamp seals and over 100 clay ceilings, administrative control marks, suggesting storage and redistribution. In other words, the site is not merely houses, it is coordination, and coordination is what fire interrupts most decisively. You can rebuild a wall, you can even rebuild a temple, but when administrative spaces burn, when storage and sealing systems are disrupted, the city loses its ability to remember its own obligations. Who owes grain? Who receives rations? What belongs where? The burn layer is not only a record of violence, it is a record of interrupted governance. This is the point where we need to be careful with our larger framing. Our title uses the word Anunnaki and the word war. The danger is to force the burn layer to play a role it cannot play, turning it into proof of a supernatural conflict. That would be irresponsible. A sling bullet is a sling bullet. But we can do something more honest and more interesting. We can treat the burn layer as the archaeological equivalent of the Sumerian hinge sentence. On the Weld Blundell Prism, the Sumerian King List, Ashmolean Museum, AN 1923-444, a clay prism about 20 by 9 centimetres, probably from Lhasa and dated around 1800 BC, there is that famous pivot the flood swept over. Then, after the flood had swept over and kingship had descended from heaven, it is a boundary line that reorganises the whole story. The King List does not describe the flood in detail. It uses the flood as a reset marker, a scar in the chronology. Burn layers do something similar in the ground. They mark a before and an after. They break continuity. They reorganise what comes next. And just as the King List implies that legitimacy must be re-established after a rupture, kingship must descend again, archaeology implies that order must be reinvented after a destruction layer. Someone clears rubble. Someone rebuilds. Someone decides whether the site is reoccupied, conquered, or abandoned. The Fizz. Org Report makes this point in a concrete way. It describes how pits dug into the destruction debris contained large amounts of southern Uruk pottery, and how the southern Uruk material dominates layers just above the destruction. The suggestion is not simply that there was violence, but that violence created a transition, one group benefiting from, or taking over, the aftermath. In other words, sudden endings are often transfers, and this is where the phrase erased overnight becomes both true and misleading. It can be true in the sense that a functioning place can cease to function within hours. Fire and collapse can do that, but it is misleading if we imagine total disappearance. What usually follows is inheritance. Someone occupies the ruins, or strips them, or rebuilds them, or repurposes them. Civilization rarely vanishes into nothing. It changes hands. That idea, civilization as restoration and inheritance rather than a clean extinction, is one of the most consistent threads across our sources. It sits in the flood tradition. The world is erased, but a survivor carries continuity forward. It sits in the king list. The flood is a hinge, but kingship continues after. It sits in curse literature. The city is stripped of its powers, but the world goes on, and the gods reassign favour elsewhere. And now it sits in archaeology. Hamakar burns, and the layers above it show that life continues, but under altered conditions. The war, then, may not be one single war. It may be the persistent conflict between urban order and the forces that can overturn it, human violence, environmental stress, political takeover, the fragile dependence on water, storage, and administration. When Mesopotamian texts describe the Anunnaki as beings who decide fates, as Orak's Ancient Mesopotamian Gods and Goddesses project explains, the implication is not that they throw spears. The implication is that the highest level of reality is imagined as a council that can authorize endings. Archaeology cannot confirm councils of gods, but it can show why the human mind would reach for that kind of explanation, because the end of a city can feel less like a battle and more like a sentence being carried out. So the burn layer becomes a bridge between our worlds of evidence. It tells us that sudden endings were physically possible early in Mesopotamian urban history. It tells us that buildings could be sealed with daily life inside. It tells us that violence could be organised at scale, enough to leave thousands of projectiles in a destruction zone. And it tells us that after such an ending, the story does not stop. It reforms. When I hold that image, walls collapsed, debris burned, clay ceilings scattered, I keep thinking back to the quiet sentences of the tablets, the way they refuse to dramatise, the way they treat catastrophe as a shift in permissions. Roads close, gates fail, canals turn brackish, nobody recognises anybody, people cannot rest, grass grows on towpaths that once carried boats. Those are literary images, yes, but the ground beneath them is real, and that is the sleep-friendly, unsettling truth we can carry forward. The ancient world did not need science fiction to imagine an erased city. The ancient world had fire, walls, hunger, and takeover. In the next chapter, we will turn from the evidence of sudden endings to the question of interpretation, how far we can responsibly go in joining these different kinds of records. If a burn layer is a scar and a tablet is a remembered wound, what is the most careful way to speak about war without turning history into fantasy? At this point in our investigation, we have enough evidence to do something that feels both careful and dangerous. Careful because we have stayed close to objects that can be named, located and checked, tablets with museum numbers, inscriptions with provenience, layers of ash and collapsed walls that can be excavated again. Dangerous because the phrase Anunnaki War tempts the mind into a single sweeping story, a clean plotline with villains and weapons and a clear ending. but the sources we've handled do not behave like a single plot. They behave like an archive. So in this chapter, I want to lay out 3 readings of the phrase Anunnaki War, 3 ways of interpreting what we've seen without forcing the material to say more than it says. Think of these readings like 3 lamps in a dark room. Each lamp lights up something real. Each lamp also throws its own shadows. And if we keep the pacing slow, we can let all 3 lamps remain visible at once, without rushing toward a verdict. The first reading is the most conservative, the second is the most pattern-based, the third is the most speculative but still disciplined, because it stays anchored to how ancient texts frame authority. And all 3 begin in the same place, with the difference between what a tablet is and what we want it to be. A tablet is not a movie scene, it is a controlled surface. On Penn Museum's flood tablet CBS 1673, exhibited as B1673 from Nippur in Iraq, written in Sumerian and dated by its script to around 1650 BC, the preserved portion is only the lower third. 6 columns remain, about 10 to 15 lines per preserved column, with the full composition estimated at around 260 lines. The museum record notes that it joins with CBS 1867, and it aligns the piece with the flood story tradition known in scholarship as ECSL 1.704. When that tablet tells the flood, it does not narrate a battlefield. It narrates a decision carried out through weather and duration, 7 days and 7 nights, ending with Ziusudra surviving and receiving eternal life from An and Enlil after Enki has mollified the Fury. And when we put that beside the well-Blundell prism, the Sumerian king list, Ashmolean Museum AN 1923-444, a clay prism about 20 by 9 centimetres, probably from Lhasa and dated around 1800 BC, we meet a similar structure. The list is not history in the modern sense, it blends myth, legend and historical material, and at its hinge point it gives us that famous reset sentence, the flood swept over. Then, after the flood had swept over and kingship had descended from heaven, again, no battlefield, just a pivot, a reset. And when we add a third major text type, the curse tradition, we see the same mechanism from another angle. In the composition known as the Cursing of a God, preserved in old Babylonian copies and presented in translation through the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature as ETCSL 2.01.05, catastrophe is described as the removal of civic powers. Inanna abandons Agode, removes the gift of battle, and hands it to the enemy. Then the text describes rulership being stripped away, eloquence taken, wisdom taken, weapons taken, gates subverted, roads emptied, hunger spreading, and even the land's basic productivity collapsing into a world where grain does not grow and fresh water turns brackish. That's where we begin. Now, 3 readings. Reading 1, Anunnaki War as a modern label for ancient catastrophe language. In this reading, Anunnaki War is not something the Sumerian texts plainly claim. It is our phrase, placed on top of a set of older descriptions that use divine decision-making to explain ruin. This reading takes the objects as they present themselves. The flood tablet speaks of a flood. It connects the event to the divine realm, yes, but it frames the mechanism as storm, water, time, survival, and post-flood reconciliation. It does not give a campaign. The king list uses the flood as a chronological reset. It does not dramatize conflict. It organizes legitimacy. The Cursing of a God describes collapse as a withdrawal of gifts and a breakdown of order. It uses intense language, yes, even violent imagery, but it is still focused on the functioning of the city, gates, roads, crops, prices, hunger, social trust. It reads like a culture explaining why a city that once seemed invincible can become unlivable. This first reading, then, is the one you would expect from an investigative archaeologist trying to keep their footing. It says, "The war is not a literal war of Anunnaki soldiers. It is a language of catastrophe and authority. The gods fight by deciding. A city falls when the conditions of survival are revoked, And erased overnight is not necessarily a claim about hours on a clock, but a claim about how quickly a system can stop being itself. This reading is sober. It protects us from sensationalism. It also protects the integrity of the sources. But it has a weakness. It can become too safe. Because it risks missing the patterns the texts themselves keep repeating. Patterns that were meaningful to ancient people, not because they were Navev, but because they were watching civilization break. Reading 2. Anunnaki War as a pattern across genres, verdict, withdrawal and transfer. This reading doesn't claim a single event. It claims a recurring structure. Across our sources, catastrophe is not random. It is narrated as a judgment, followed by a transfer of legitimacy. The king list literally makes kingship portable. It moves from city to city as if authority is an object that can be relocated. The flood is one moment when the chain is broken and then the chain resumes. The message is not extinction. The message is succession. The cursing of a god follows the same logic in a harsher register. It describes not only violence but unmaking. Messengers no longer travel, the courier's boat no longer passes the rivers, prisoners man the watch, brigands occupy highways. In the world of that text, this is what it looks like when the system that allows exchange and stability has been torn. And then, this is crucial, it describes the aftermath as a new normal that people try to inhabit and cannot. If someone decides, I will dwell in this city, may he not enjoy the pleasures of a dwelling place. It's the language of a place that is still there, but no longer livable. Now place that beside the archaeological record of sudden endings. At Hamukar, archaeologists described collapsed walls, heavy bombardment by sling bullets, and an ensuing fire, an urban context that becomes a sealed deposit. And in the same reporting, the layers above that destruction are described as containing abundant southern Uruk pottery, suggesting a shift in who benefits from the aftermath. This is the same logic as the texts. Catastrophe is a hinge, followed by transfer. So reading 2 says, the Anunnaki War is not one battle. It is a cultural model for why power moves. The God's Council, the Flood, the Curse, the Burn Layer, these are different expressions of the same structural fact. Cities can be unmade, and when they are, authority does not vanish, it relocates. This reading is stronger than the first in one important way. It can connect text and archaeology without forcing either one to pretend it is the other. It allows the burn layer to remain a burn layer, collapsed walls, projectiles, fire, while still acknowledging why Mesopotamian literature so often speaks in the grammar of decrees. Because in the lived experience of cities, collapse often does feel like a verdict. But it also has a weakness. If everything becomes a pattern, we risk flattening history. We risk turning real differences between flood myth, curse literature, and archaeological destruction into one vague theme. So we need a third reading that stays grounded, but allows us to ask the question your title insists on asking. Reading 3, Anunnaki War as jurisdictional conflict, war over who may decide the fate of civilization. This is the most speculative reading, but it is not a fantasy reading. It is a reading about authority. Orak's Ancient Mesopotamian Gods and Goddesses project describes Anunna, Anunnaki, Anunnaku, not as a single deity, but as a group designation that shifts over time. In Sumerian texts, it can refer to the highest gods, and one of their primary functions is to decide fates. It can also appear as a group of judges, as in the tradition where the Anunna are the 7 judges. If we take that seriously, then an Anunnaki war would not necessarily be fought with weapons. It would be fought with decisions. And that brings us back to the most unsettling common thread across our sources. Civilization is treated as conditional. On CBS 100673, a world can be ended, and then a single survivor carries the seed of continuity forward. On AN 1923 444, kingship can be interrupted, and then descend again. On ETCSL 2.01.05, a gade's civic gifts can be stripped, eloquence, wisdom, weapons, and the city can remain physically present while becoming socially dead. And on Gudier's cylinders, Louvre MMB 1512 and MMB 1511, restoration is framed as the reinstallation of correct order through temple building, purification, and the reorganisation of services that include agriculture, fisheries, building, and even war, as if stability is a managed system that can be broken and then reset. So reading 3 says, the war is a conflict over jurisdiction, over who may decide whether human institutions continue. In this reading, the Anunnaki are not a squad of invaders. They are the symbolic expression of a higher court. And what gets destroyed overnight is not necessarily bodies first, but legitimacy, the permission for a city to remain a city. This reading can explain why the texts speak the way they do, why they describe catastrophe as withdrawal rather than siege, why they obsess over gates, roads, grain, water, and the ability of people to recognize one another, why they frame rebuilding as obedience to divine instruction rather than mere human resilience. Because if the deepest fear is that civilization is not guaranteed, then the deepest answer is that civilization must be authorized. Now, I want to end this chapter the way a careful investigator ends a long day in the archive, by refusing to choose too quickly. All 3 readings can be held at once. The first keeps us honest about what the sources do and do not claim. The second allows us to see why different kinds of evidence, tablets and burn layers, echo one another in structure. The third lets us approach the Anunnaki war idea without turning it into science fiction, by treating it as a question of authority and fate rather than of monsters and lasers. And as we move toward our closing chapter, we will return to where we began, a quiet object in a museum, a fragment that survived a world that did not. Because whether we call it flood, curse, war, or collapse, the real mystery is not that civilizations can end. The real mystery is that the clay still waits, and the names still remain readable. There is a moment, late in the day, when a museum becomes quieter than it was meant to be. Not empty, never empty, but softened. Footsteps thin out, voices fade, the lights stay steady, the glass cases keep doing their work, and the objects, which have already outlasted empires, return to what they have always been, patient. This final chapter returns to that patience, not to give us comfort, but to give us a boundary. We began with a title that carries an edge. Sumerian texts reveal Anunnaki war that erased entire civilizations overnight. And over the course of this investigation, that edge changed. It became less like a shout and more like a hinge the ancient world kept building into its stories and into its records and into the ground itself. On one side of the hinge is a world that looks stable. On the other side is a world that can no longer pretend it is. In the Penn Museum's Middle East galleries, on display, there is a baked clay tablet from Nippur in Iraq called the Flood Tablet, object number CBS 10673, exhibited as B10673. The museum catalogue dates it to the Old Babylonian period, around 1650 BC, written in Sumerian. It survives as the lower third of a longer composition, with 6 columns preserved, 3 on each side, each preserved column holding about 10 to 15 lines, and the complete tablet estimated at roughly 260 lines. The museum record notes that CBS 1673 joins with CBS 10867, and it carries additional identifiers that follow it through modern scholarship and cataloguing, including CD line number P265876 and the flood story composite number Q000357. Even its measurements are recorded with quiet precision, about 13.3 centimetres long, 10.16 centimetres wide, and 1.9 centimetres thick. When you stand in front of an object like that, small enough to be held, heavy enough to endure, grand claims become difficult to maintain in their original form. Not because the story becomes smaller, but because it becomes accountable. Because the flood story on this tablet does not read like a battlefield. It reads like a decision executed through systems, instruction, warning, storm, a measured duration, 7 days and 7 nights, and then survival, sacrifice, reconciliation. A world ends and a world begins again, with an almost administrative calm. Overnight stops meaning spectacle. It starts meaning something closer to a switch, something in the order of reality being turned off and then partially restored. And then we place that flood hinge beside another hinge, one that doesn't even try to dramatise. In the Ashmolean Museum there is a clay prism called the Weld Blundell Prism, museum number AN 1123444, one of the fullest versions of the Sumerian king list. The Ashmolean describes it as a 4-sided prism with 2 columns of cuneiform on each face, recording in Sumerian a succession of cities where kingship was invested, the rulers who reigned, and the length of their reigns. It blends mythic reigns with more historically grounded ones, and it contains one of the most famous hinge lines in Mesopotamian literature, "The flood swept over." Then, after the flood had swept over and kingship had descended from heaven, the catastrophe is not narrated, it is stated, and history is not ended, it is restarted. That's not a modern way of speaking. It is an ancient way of stabilising the world after rupture by insisting that legitimacy continues even if it moves. We also listen to another register, the register of punishment. In the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, there is an old Babylonian version of a composition known as the Cursing of Agade, ETCSL 2.01.05, where catastrophe is described as a stripping away of civic life. Inanna abandons Agade. The gift of battle is removed. The text describes powers being taken away, eloquence, wisdom, weapons, and then it descends into a portrait of breakdown, roads failing, hunger rising, prices distorting, and even the land itself refusing to produce. It is not just violence, it is defunctionalization, the city remaining in place, but losing the conditions that make it livable. And then we stepped away from clay and listened to earth. At Hamakar, in the far northeast of modern Syria near the Iraqi border, archaeologists described a destruction around 3500 BC that left behind collapsed walls, heavy bombardment by sling bullets, and an ensuing fire. In reporting that circulated through FISTA.org, the excavation leaders described recovering more than 1,200 smaller oval sling bullets and about 120 larger round clay balls from the destruction debris, and they emphasised how such violent episodes can create frozen contexts, sealing daily life in place beneath collapse. Whether or not that was a single day in the lived experience, archaeology shows how quickly a functioning space can stop functioning, how fast a room can become a sealed archive. So if we've learned anything, it is this: erased overnight is not the only way to speak about sudden endings, and it may not be the best way, because the ancient evidence points again and again toward a different idea that civilization is conditional. A city is a system. A city is water and grain and roads and gates and storage and trust. A city is also an agreement between people and what they believe governs the world. And when that agreement breaks, through flood, through war, through drought, through takeover, through internal fracture, the city can still stand and yet become unreadable as itself. Now we return to the word that has hovered over this entire project: Anunnaki. Here, the responsible approach is not to claim we found a single Anunnaki army marching across a plain. The texts don't give us that. What they give us is a worldview in which the highest powers decide fates. In Iraq's ancient Mesopotamian gods and goddesses project, the Anunna, also called Anunnaki or Anunnaku in different periods, are presented as a group designation that shifts in meaning across time, and one of their primary functions in Sumerian sources is to decide fates. In some contexts they appear as judges, So if we use the phrase Anunnaki war, the best reading is not necessarily warfare in the modern sense, but conflict over jurisdiction, over who has the right to decree the continuation or the end of human order. That's the sober centre of this story. Not certainty, not spectacle, jurisdiction. Which brings us to the last quiet truth. Everything we touched in this investigation is also an artefact of modern recovery.
The Penn Museum's flood tablet CBS 1673 is recorded as coming from the Babylonian expedition to Nippur in 1896, with its catalogue trail and associated numbers 10673, CBS 1673, CBS 1867, showing how ancient fragments become modern objects. And projects like Nippur Digitized, directed by Professor Age Westenholz, exist because even the excavation records are an archive that must be recovered. Handwritten notebooks, letters and photographs scattered across institutions, difficult to read but necessary if we want to speak carefully.
About provenience, context, and how knowledge was made. This is where the script ends, because it has to end somewhere, not with a final verdict, but with an image that is truer than any conclusion. A room in a museum, shelving, boxes, drawers, clay in darkness, waiting. And the most unsettling part is not what we don't know, it's what we do know. We know that sudden endings happened, we know that cities burned, we know that floods, in story and perhaps in memory, became the language for a reset of the world. We know that the ancient scribes were not trying to entertain us, they were trying to stabilise meaning after rupture. And we know that the evidence is partial by nature, not because the past is teasing us, because the past was broken, then gathered again, piece by piece, and labelled and stored and placed behind glass. So if we leave this story with one final thought, let it be this: the clay does not rush, the clay does not dramatise, the clay waits. And if we want to speak about lost civilizations with any responsibility at all, we have to learn to wait with it, quietly, precisely, and without forcing the void to fill itself with our imagination.